Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I've analysed many a weapon from pop culture to see how practical and effective they would be in real life, and I'll also look at how well they would function if we could take the similar kind of liberties that exist in the fantasy worlds that these weapons come from, like if we had superhuman strength, or we could concede that this weapon is much lighter, or sometimes we even need to try and assume it if we haven't been told. But there's a very important weapon that I haven't looked at, which is actually my own iconic pop culture weapon from my series, Chronicles of Everfall, the first book being Shadow of the Conqueror, and with a short film being made, and in celebration to the fact that the replica, not exactly as you see here, there's one difference, that's made by Calamissil, is now available for purchase. You can go and get your own version of Imperius right now. This one is a special custom one that they made for me. The only difference is this custom paint job that they did on the blade to try and reflect Imperius's crystal-like structure that is reflected in the book. But the version that you can purchase is exactly like this, but without the text on it. This was a special one celebrating the production of the short film, but other than the text on the blade, this is exactly what you can purchase, and it is amazing. And of course, link in the description below, it'll take you right to the sales page, and you have the option of getting the blade come in a metal finish, actual steel finish, not just the magical Imperious blue, that might be able to be adapted more easily into your own LARP adventures and things like that, if you can't explain why this robot has a magical blue blade in your own setting or your own kind of kit loadout. But if you want a really cool, unique design, swept-hilded sword with, pointed quillins out of steel so it fits better, meaning that the foam blade is painted to look like steel, not that the actual blade is made out of real steel. It's not. That's available as well. And so I am going to break down and analyze Imperius's design, okay? Were there any mistakes I made? How would it actually work if it really existed? Because I went into this design purposely taking advantage of certain fictional fantasy elements that exist in the setting, so then would Imperius be a functional sword if you actually made it one-to-one, with a couple of differences that you'd have to concede to. And then after that, I'll be doing a proper full review of Calimacil's Imperius model, like how they adapted it, how safe is it, things that they really did well, and is it, worth purchasing? So let's break down Imperius itself. Now, as you can see, it's obviously a fantasy design with embellishments. I wanted it to look impressive. In fact, I wanted to look imperious. I wanted to look royal, regal, something that catches the eye and something that displays authority, but also station, wealth, and position. That was the whole kind of mindset philosophy. But before we get into the in-world explanation of some of the design choices, if we were to take Imperius from the book and make it in the real world, would it be a functional and practical weapon? Well, there's a couple of things that would be no, it wouldn't be. Imperius, canonically in the book, has a blade that's only 1 millimeter thick. Now, that's basically impossible to replicate. You could do it, but it'll be so floppy it would be an unfunctional blade. And of course, when it comes to a foam replica like this that's safe for impact and actual sparring and even LARP and stuff, it can't be 1 mil thick. That's basically impossible making it out of foam. But I have a couple of things to say about the width of this Imperius blade in my review of the Calamissil model. So we'll wait until we get to that part in the video. But again, if Imperius was made in the real world, the blade would be too thin and floppy, so you would need to thicken it. But if we would take that concession and thicken the blade to the appropriate standard level that most functional sword blades are made to, with a proper distal taper, getting thinner at the tip, and then keeping everything else the same, because we don't really need to modify like other parts of the blade to make it even usable in the real world, because if we were to say you could modify everything to make it more practical, well then we're not being fair in our true analysis of would this be an effective sword if we made it in real life. But we need to do that one for the blade at least. Okay, what then? Well, there's a couple of interesting elements that would come up to in reality, make Imperius not the most functional real-life blade. And I am interested in commissioning a not exactly steel. I might actually get it made out of aluminium, because again, we're going to come into an interesting problem. Imperius, in the design for a one-handed sword, has a uniquely long sword blade. This was purposeful in the book, and it is because in the book, the blade being only 1 millimeter thick would be extremely light, which means we could get away with a much longer blade, and because of the magical enchantment on it, it becomes massively, stiff and it won't bend, you get the advantage of a longer blade. Now, there are longer bladed one-handed swords in real life, but they're a bit different to the kind of proportions of Imperius here. And of course, I'm referring to rapiers. Rapiers are exceptionally long one-handed swords. So much so that oftentimes the blades are as long as many two-handed swords, like the standard lengths of long swords. The way that the rapier can get away with it is in a number of ways. One, you'll notice the blades are very, very thin, and so they're basically shrinking the blade that way to stretch it out lengthwise. Now, you'll notice a key difference between a standard rapier and Imperius, and that is the width. Imperius is a much wider bladed sword. In actual fact, it's even more broader in terms of its width than just many regular swords. That's long swords, arming swords, not just rapiers. So I've got my rapier and arming sword here to compare. Have a look at the width, the actual kind of distance from edge to edge of the blade. Of course, the rapier is exceptionally thin, and on this one, this rapier isn't even as long as most rapiers could reach you. This is almost the same length as an arming sword, I believe. Oh no, it's a bit longer in the blade. And so rapiers, yeah, of course, longer. But let's compare the width of even this arming sword to the width of Imperius. You'll see that the width of Imperius, not talking about the depth, but the width is even wider than standard arming swords. And, in terms of the width of blades, you can get exceptionally wider ones at the base, but they usually have a very sharp taper then. And so it's a bit of a balance. There are rare exceptions of particularly broad-bladed swords. The arming sword misidentified often as a medieval broadsword, but the standard breadth of these swords are kind of much more conservative in reality. And with Imperius, because I could take advantage of the fact that the blade being thinner and lighter, I could afford it being wider as a result, and even kind of wider as it goes up. There is a taper on it, as you can see, but not a huge, strong taper. As a result, because if you were to make this sword in real life, needing to be thicker, it would be much heavier. And then there is the issue with the length. Canonically, Imperius's blade length is actually a bit longer than even a longsword, a two-handed longsword we're talking about here. Now, with Calimacil's version, they do have limits because of LARP rules, but they still actually made the blade much longer than your standard one-handed sword to get close to the full length that Imperius is supposed to be. Now, a while ago, I had a great cosplay prop maker contact me to make Imperius as a custom job, and he made the blade length of that version canonically the same as it is in the book. And this is it right here. Now, he actually did a great job with the materials he had available, and he worked off the 3D model I sent him. The 3D model, unfortunately, and this was my fault, I didn't make the hilt big enough, and so it's actually really hard to get your hand in this hilt because he 3D printed it based off of my model. Calamissil, they noticed that same issue, and of course they corrected it, and so hand right there, it's perfect size and perfect fit. You'll notice the Calamissil retail version is only slightly shorter. They got really close to the proper full length size of Imperius. And to demonstrate, this is Calamissil's replica of the Witcher's steel sword, so it's a two-handed longsword, and let's compare the blade lengths. Imperius, so again, this really has, just like the book, a two-handed length blade on a one-handed, sword. The amazing thing is the balance of, I'll mention that in the review, because, man, the balance and point control for such a long LARP blade like this, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Making a one-handed sword with a blade length of this size and width would be really difficult to handle, especially if it was made out of steel or anything functional as a sword blade. It would just be too heavy. It would be impractical. Like Imperius, brought into real life, ultimately is an impractical design because the length and width, therefore the weight of the blade, you just wouldn't be able to manage it. You would have to make it more functional, thinning it and shorten a bit, or make it out of a lighter material, but then it wouldn't be a real sword, would it? But the real one that I want to, commission to be made out of, metal, ultimately I'd need to get it made out of aluminium or something really light, a metal that's very light. There's another really distinct feature about Imperius that we need to discuss, and that is its swept hilt. You'll notice that it has these additional spiked quillins. This was for an aesthetic choice that I made because Imperius was meant to look like a flaring sun on profile, so these would be the sunbeams there. If you were to transfer this into real life, could you do it practically? Well, yes and no. They do add additional weight. You can get away with designs like this, you know, a little bit of extra weight here and there if it doesn't increase it too much. But if these were solid metal, and to do it properly in real life, it would probably brass or something like that to get this golden-ish look. These additional quillins would probably be too heavy. Now, because this is the LARP version, they needed to make the size of the sweepings. So the sweepings are these parts of the hilt here that actually sweep around the handle. And then the quillins, which comprise the crossguard, are the points that go exactly perpendicular away from the handle. Both the quillins and the sweepings of the swept hilt on this one are, by necessity, thicker than the canonical version in the book. And so if we were to do a one-to-one from the book to real life, they would be much thinner, therefore lighter, and you might be able to get away with adding these additional, you know, pointed quillins because it wouldn't be adding too much weight as a result. If they're as thick as the ones we see here, they would be adding too much weight in my opinion. And it's interesting that this Calamissil version has only increased the width, only by a little bit, and it still looks absolutely great, but that would have a real-world effect. And so this swept hilt, if we were to actually take the Calamissil version one for one into real life, would be double the weight of Imperius's real swept hilt because the sweepings and the crossguard are just a little bit thicker. Now, because this is made out of rubber, they need to be thicker so they'll be more durable, they can take the hits and stuff like that. And the actual increasing of the diameter isn't, like, in profile and look, it doesn't look actually out of place being thicker, and so it still looks brilliant and it's got all of that. But as you can see from this great cosplay version that was made for me a while ago, you see the thickness of the swept hilt is much thinner. So maybe you could get away with making Imperius's swept hilt with these extra pointed quillins if it was made out of steel, if the actual diameter of them was smaller, therefore lighter. Because there is this other side effect that comes from this design, which actually has a really interesting practical benefit in combat. And that is these quillins can function to trap opponents' blades as they come down and strike the crossguard. And that you literally use it as a type of sword breaker or sword catcher. Now, sword breaker, look at the European sword breaker. See it how it has those tooths on the back? That was literally made for other opponents' blades to slide in between those gaps. You twist them and lock the blade in place, locking away the opponent's weapon, opening them up for your counter attack. And it could be with the blade if you spin it around right, or with an off-handed weapon. Imperius's crossguard would literally function like that. And it's interesting, this is one of those things there, it's a really clever thing. I wish I could take credit for it, but I didn't think of that when I made the design. I was just thinking of the aesthetics, the look. I want it to look like a flaring sun, and hey, that looks really cool. But not only has people pointed out, hey Shad, do you realize that these, points would trap opponents' blades? When we were training with the Calamissil reproductions, we found that they function exactly like that. So much so that in the choreography that I was lucky enough to do myself for the short film, we have choreographed a sequence of the opponent's blade literally getting locked in Imperius's crossguard and him bringing it up, locking, and then slashing back. And it worked brilliantly because, one, even though this is rubber, it's stiff enough that it held fidelity on camera. That is, we could get away with it. And with the right cutting and motion, we were able to manage to pull it off. So literally found this in real practice, and it would function like this in real life. When the sword's crossed, and if there was any sliding where the blade hit comes down, you can lock the blade in like that and trap the opponent's sword and manipulate it around, not just there, but in the other trapping points on this quillin. So even if it comes in lower, and you've got full protection because it's a swept hilt, so you could actually go out of your way to trap opponents' blades with these as they come in there, and if you miss, it just hits the crossguard and slides off. Your hand is perfectly protected, and so you can still trap like this, manipulate, pull, and slash. And that's actually a surprisingly highly functional result of this design that, unfortunately, I can't even take credit for, but then people pointed out, and I realized in real practice that that's really cool. I've never seen a design like that historically. The most comparable one is the sword breaker, but that has the trapping points on the blade itself, not on a hilt. But perhaps it wasn't done on hilts because they had too much extra weight and they didn't bother with it. But maybe if you made them thin enough, you could get away with it. Who knows? And if you did, well, again, so practical that we even included it in the choreography of the short film for a very specific sequence. You'll see it when it comes out. And that's one interesting advantage of Imperius if you made it in real life. And of course, the advantage of having the protection of a swept hilt. Now, just on a note about blades that you could also cut with that had a swept hilt, because people think swept hilts are only with rapiers, right? And rapiers are primarily a thrusting. You can cut with rapiers, not as well as other swords, but I mean, get it on the neck and slide it down, you'll slice open someone's jugular. I mean, so you can do lethal cuts with a rapier still, if they're sharpened. Some weren't as sharp on the cut because they weren't emphasized that. Anyway, there are swords that have broader blades, not as broad as Imperius, that are specifically cut and thrust swept hilt swords. Then they're usually called side swords. So if we were to name the type of sword Imperius is, it's technically a fantasy side sword with a much longer blade than standard. And so going back to the advantages of Imperius, well, you get the advantage of the full swept hilt, but then the interesting trapping thing of the hilt itself, but the overweighted sword is its big undoing if you were to just make it in real life. In regards to the fantasy aspects of Imperius design, the width of the blade, the length of the blade, the elaborate hilt, it is actually far more realistic. Even though I'm pointing out unrealistic elements, it's far more realistic than many fantasy design swords, also including those ones that we see in video games like World of Warcraft swords. My goodness, they go extreme. And so even though there are fantasy elements, it's still far more conservative, realistic fantasy design. I'm acknowledging the fantasy elements that aren't wholly practical, but it's still more practical than many other ones. Now, of course, in the book itself, it's a magical weapon. Originally, the blade was made out of wood. I retconned that to be a 1mm thick steel, and the handle is still originally made out of wood, carved. And then when you sunforge it, you can make it basically indestructible. And that meant I could take liberties in the design, knowing that it would be much lighter. And I've talked about, how fantasy materials can affect sword design in this, older video, where I actually was revealing Imperius's cosplay version that you've seen in this video. Because different materials means you can take liberties in the design of weapons that you wouldn't necessarily get away with if you were restricted with regular materials like steel. That's exactly what I did with Imperius. Meant I could make it a bit broader, a bit longer, but as we found out in this video, Pop-culture Weapons Analysed, that would affect its one-to-one transfer into the real world if it was made out of real materials and existed in real life. But if you could transfer those magical properties with it, well, then you have an exceptionally light, hugely dangerous, supernaturally sharp, indestructible sword with a really cool feature of not only a trapping ability on the sword, but it's also a spiked crossguard. You can strike people with it, and it's a pretty deadly design. Now, I'm biased when I say I really like the Imperius design. I designed it myself for the purpose of being awesome, and so, yes, I like it, but it's also really gratifying to see so many people loving the Imperius design as well, and you can get your own, and when I say high quality, Calamissil, I'm not kidding, they make the best LARP swords in the world, and having them make the Imperius reproduction is a dream come true, and the quality is phenomenal. I mean that, and I'm going to review it and show and demonstrate to you. So remember, link in the description below to get your own Imperius reproduction. So there we go. That is my objective analysis of Imperius's design, if it exists in the real world. And now I want to get to the review of the Calamissil reproduction, okay? The replica of Imperius. You've noticed that I have two versions of Imperius. This one is a LARP safe one with very important features, and it's the same that you could purchase just with a different pattern on the blade. And the finish that they put on the blade, because if they did this for every single one, it took an hour for them to do this crystal-like pattern, and that'd be too expensive to do on every single one. But the finish that they put on the retail version is really, really cool because it has this kind of glossy, glass-like finish to make it reflect the, how Imperius looks. This one, though, is actually a copy of the film prop version, even though it has the same finish as the retail version that you can buy. Big difference with this one is the tip. See how it doesn't bend? This was made so in the film, when they clashed, the tip doesn't flop around and it looks, looks more realistic. Of course, in the film, we're going to be doing a visual effect to make it glow, make it look thinner and other things like that. And sometimes we're going to digitally remove the blade completely. But we needed action props that were safe enough because it's still, they're foam versions, but were just slightly different and a bit more stiff. And of course, you don't get the text on the retail version. But this one is a copy of their LARP safe versions, and they have something that's really impressive. And they've done something different as well about the tip, because Imperius, and Patrick mentioned, so I've done a tour of Calamissil showing how they make their phenomenal blades. Check it out if you haven't seen the video already. And Patrick actually has a video on the Calamissil YouTube channel talking about unique challenges, and he talks about the tip. So I'm going to come back to the tip here as well. But Imperius posed unique challenges to Calamissil because there's a couple of distinct differences. The, thinness of the actual blade along this profile, how acute the tip is as well. They don't usually make swords that acute, and also the big challenge is the swept hilt. I have not seen a complex swept hilt like this on any LARP sword. It's blown me away at how... Well, it's literally 1 for 1, except for the thickness. That's the only difference. But in terms of where all the sweepings are, they got it perfect. It's exactly how I designed it, and that they managed to pull that off with a mold is astounding. It's like a 3-part mold that they have to like separate sides and then separate it to get it out. But they pulled it off, and it's incredible. Like, it's got a full, genuine swept hilt that's made out of rubber. I'm amazed. They did such an incredible job with that. So there's that. But as I mentioned, there are other breakthroughs with this sword that Calamissil has not done on any other sword. That's how amazed I am with it, but also how top tier the quality. Like, they pulled out all the stops. They spent, so much more development on this to get it right than many of their other sword models because of the unique challenges. For instance, let's go back to the tip. For LARP-safe swords, they have a fiberglass rod that runs down the middle. And the fiberglass rod, like a lot of different manufacturers use that technique, but how they execute that technique can cause, well, let me show you what they can cause. This is not a Calamissil sword. This is a LARP sword. One of the first LARP swords I bought when I even found that they were making foam, replica swords. And, I liked that it was mostly realistic. Like, it had a fairly realistic, crossguard and stuff. And so I bought it, but you'll notice what happened here, okay? After significant abuse, the tip snapped off, revealing the fiberglass rod on the inside. Now, I falsely assumed that, look, it's only a little bit of a hard spot there, just don't thrust with it, it's still good, and I use it a lot. But there was an accident with this one where someone was far too energetic and they weren't thinking, and they threw it at their opponent, and that fiberglass kind of rod there knocked someone there, cut them, blood, wasn't good. It was small, superficial, so no serious injury, but still, it drew blood. And I've never used this since because it's just not safe. And of course, now it's damaged. Issues, right? These are issues that come in with many kind of LARP swords, but not Calamissil. This is why I promote Calamissil, why I've partnered up with them, why I bought them in the first place before I even partnered with them, because when you really look for the best quality, most durable and safe, and some of the safest, granted Calamissil, foam is a little bit stiffer, but they do that for the durability, so they last longer, and in my opinion, they are perfectly soft enough to be safe enough. You can injure someone with softer foam swords and anything if you just hit too hard, okay? And when I say injure, I'm not talking about like devastating injury. You can hurt people, okay? Swing hard enough with nearly anything and you can still hurt people. But Calamissil blades are really safe, and one of the reasons why they're safe is because they're so durable and they don't snap off or reveal the actual harder fiberglass rod, and this is what can happen if lesser quality foam sword is made. So how you transition that fiberglass rod to the tip is really significant, okay? 1, to keep the tip durable, but also 2, so the tip doesn't, accidentally rip out and hit someone and draw blood, because it not only can happen, I've seen it happen. So Patrick at Calamissil, they engineered a brilliant way to get a thinner, more acute tip and make it safe with the internal rod. And you can actually feel it. Look how much this bends for safety, and it doesn't snap when you even put a lot of pressure on it. What they actually made, and Patrick shows this as one of his YouTube videos, looking at, talking about some of the challenges of making Imperius, is that they have the fiberglass rod transition, even employing like Kevlar in some of the parts, to kind of a rubber tip. It transitions from fiberglass and it turns to rubber along here to get really flexible, but it's also connected to the fiberglass part really securely, so it won't snap off still, but enables it to bend much, much more than many other swords. This is Calamissil's Bellator 2 model. One of the first Calamissil swords I bought. Really safe, and I have put this through huge abuse and it's still strong, but this is one of the earlier models, and look at how much the tip bends, okay? Do you see that? Now compare that to Imperius. This is like an innovative breakthrough that they've made, and it's just as strong and durable as normal. So again, I have to give them mad props, and if I'm reviewing this, even objectively, even though I'm fanboying, it's my own sword, and there's bias in it, but when I try and take away my bias and look at it objectively, look at just the objective quality measures that exist on this compared to even some of their earlier models, which are still great, really safe, but it would be harder, even with this more acute tip. See how acute the tip is compared to this previous model? It is harder to injure someone with Imperius because it's so flexible than it is with one of their previous models, and their previous models are still really safe. This is why Imperius, separate to it being my sword from my book and everything, if we were to just look at this as a LARP weapon, this is one of the most innovative and advanced LARP weapons you can buy on the market because of the breakthroughs that they've made in its design to reach new levels of design and quality. Because one of the other things that they managed, Imperius, is the blade is much thinner than so many other blades. Compare it to their previous model. Right? Look at how much thinner Imperius. It's almost, they've reduced the width of this by a third to get it much, much thinner, yet it's still as durable. And look at how much this foam edge compresses. That is a crazy amount of compression and therefore safety. It's really impressive. The other impressive thing, with the blade being so narrow, like for standard LARP swords. Like, let me show you a non-Calamissil LARP sword and the type of width that they need to put into their versions. Now, no shade on them. They're still a good, brand. And I still consider this one a good LARP sword. But I have to say, one of the drawbacks for me is how excessively thick the blade is, almost bulbous so. And even being thinner, there is still heaps of padding on this side. You can actually compress it quite a decent amount, and so there's still full padding. It's really light and exceptionally safe. So Imperius is one of the thinnest along this plane, narrowest, and most acute LARP blades I have ever seen made. And to reach that design profile with the same safety and the same durability that Calamissil have been able to maintain with the other models, it's genuinely astounding. The fact that my sword, Imperius, ends up being one of the most advanced LARP swords I've ever seen on the market is a bit of a dream come true. It's really cool. And this is me trying to take away my bias and just review it objectively as a LARP weapon. If I didn't know where this blade came from canonically, who invented it or whatever, I'd be like, look at that. So thin. Yeah, so like these are the things I would be noticing. I'd be like, this is genuinely impressive. And again, I'd be impressed, like, how that. And then the thing that would really impress me is the complete. Like I said, I've never seen a LARP sword with a hilt as complex as this on the market, because it's hard to make molds like this. Yet Calamissil did it. So when I say, if I was to give my objective review of this just as a LARP weapon, I'm not lying when I say this is one of the most impressive foam replica LARP weapons I've ever seen on the market. The durability, the look, the profile, the finish. There is one other amazing thing about this sword model, again, just if I was to look at divorce from where it comes from, who invented or anything like this, is the fact that it is amazingly agile in the hands. I put these through their paces. We trained with them. We were using them on sets. I spent days swinging this around, okay, and I don't have too much room to go through here, but I've got, B-roll footage to show you. The amount of point control you get for a blade length of this size is astounding, because this is one of the other unique features about Imperius. Its blade length is as long as Calamissil's standard two-handed longsword length blades. Again, I've already shown, but have a look, okay? If we were to get them close right there. And to have this much control, because it's funny, these lengths of blades are the same. And then I test it out. I have more control over Imperius than I do this one. Again, this one wasn't made for it, but one of the other drawbacks is there's not as an acute profile taper, and it's also wider along this thing as well, which makes the blade overall heavier and more cumbersome to use. And then compared to Imperius, which has a wider, broader blade, just as long, but because it's thinner and it has this tapering, it feels great in hands. This is literally one of the best feeling one-handed LARP swords I've ever used, and it's got a much longer blade than standard, and yet it is so great to just, I can't wait for you guys to get your own version, swing it around, and just have a feel how awesome this is in the hand, and have some fun with it. Go to LARPs, do cosplay, do whatever. I'll just hang it on your wall because it looks great as well. They're brilliant. So not only is it, as I mentioned, one of the best quality LARP swords I've ever seen on the market, it's also my sword from my novel, which is a bit of a dream come true. To see the replica of Imperius made with such astounding quality and also it's fun. It's fun to use. You can get your own, link in the description, and hats off to Calamissil. There's a reason why we're partnering up together, because I've always said they make some of the best ones I've ever seen, and now they have made the best LARP sword I've ever seen, and I'm just blessed and lucky enough that it happens to be the sword from my book, which is awesome. And if you think I'm being biased, I've tried to point out objective standards about, you know, safety, how much, like, look at the curving there compared to the curving that they've had on other, it's amazing, right? And the extra technology and innovations they've made to pull this off and to make, like, again, just see how many swept hilts as complex as this you see on the market for LARP swords. There's barely any, all right? So these are objective standards I'm applying, and I'm fanboying over it because it's so awesome. And then I just get the so then when I allow my own realization that this is my sword, all right? Then I really get excited, because it is a dream come true. It's absolutely amazing. And I hope you guys get to experience for yourself, because now it's available. You can get your own, and which is even better. Okay, so my review of Imperious design overall, why, you know, its special unique design, its width and its length is justified with the fantasy it exists in. And you can make your own fantasy, because remember, there's a steel version, not a blue version, and you could this be your enchanted weapon of your hero, or in your LARP adventure or whatnot, and explain, you know, is there magical reasons why it has this design? But honestly, this is the other thing, I should really mention this. Remember, Imperius is still a far more practical fantasy design than many other fantasy designs. I've acknowledged those areas where it would be, you know, a little more impractical if we made it one-to-one real life, but you could explain it in your fantasies, you know, is it a mithril sword? Who knows? So that's really cool, and I think... I know. I need to get the steel one for myself as well, because then I could go to LARPs, and then, because they might say, but still a blue blade looks so cool. I'm going to get all of them, I think. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed, and of course I hope to see you on the next video on Shadiversity. So until that time, farewell.